Assalamualaikum. Yang Maha Mulia Paduka Sri Sultan Perak, Tuan-tuanku, ladies and gentlemen. So we've heard in the last couple of sessions and also from Jomo the characterizations of inequalities in Malaysia in its various manifestations. Professor Jomo ended with some policy prescriptions, and if I may, since I have 3 panelists to be part of this discussion, let me just try to bucket policy response with regard to inequality into three baskets, so to speak. One, with regard to addressing the current needs of the consequences of inequality, be it poverty, be it about gender inequality, be it about the treatment of pensioners and retirees, the old, and so on. That's one basket of policy responses. The other basket would be how to effect some sort of redistribution or how to put in place programs by any fiscal tools, fiscal or taxation policies to effect this sort of distribution. So that's one basket of policy response. The last basket is how to actually grow the income at the right places, having distributed from the right places to address it, then how to grow income in the right places. So we're fortunate to have 3 very different people here. Johan is the only one from government, so he have to hold the fort here. I'm like working for the government in some very weird way, so I can do a bit of that, but I'll leave that to Johan. But Professor Tengku Aizan from UPM has worked with, if I may describe perhaps wrongly, marginalized in some sense population. Dr. Amjad Rabi from UNICEF, not just restricted to the issues around UNICEF sort of issues, but I wouldn't pigeonhole him in that regard, but maybe he can comment slightly on a broader issue. So let me start with you, since you're on the opposite end. Can you comment on the efficacy, the effectiveness of Malaysian government policy responses with regard to using fiscal and taxation tools to effect the redistribution in order to address the whole question of inequality?
Thank you very much, Tunko. Tansari Datu, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for this opportunity to be here with distinguished keynote speaker and other speakers, as well as Mr. Johan and Tunko as well. Before I respond to your question, if I may, just to make a little bit of context by establishing or looking at the hypothesis before I start my discussion, is that not every disparity is inequity. And why I wanted to say this, because certain disparity is required or needed to create the incentive structure to encourage people to accumulate human capital and get more rewarded in the capital market. And related to this, like just to give an example, I always like to compare Malaysia with OECD countries. I think we should start comparing Malaysia with the right peers. So if we look at, for instance, in Canada, we look at the wage for secondary or post-secondary education to somebody with secondary education. There is 60% premium, wage premium to reward for that. So it's justifiable to me because we need to create the incentive structure. In the US, it goes to 80%. In Malaysia, here it's 100%. So we see it's exaggerated form of disparity that maybe requires certain interventions. And to go directly to the point where I wanted to focus on policy responses is to say that there are several instruments that the government should use and currently using. The first instrument, I think, it's to look at increasing the assets of the poor. And when I say asset, it doesn't necessarily mean the typical, what comes in our mind that give land or others. But to remember that asset also is a human capital. So the government, firstly, it's very important to intervene with making sure that our children, that they receive the quality education that will make them competitors in the vision of the young Ahmad Berhormat, that will become one of the top 20 countries by 2050. So we need to invest now. And just certain statistics, I would like to come back to it, where I think why this is critical. Malaysia, in comparison to upper middle income country, the completion rate of secondary education here, it's defined many ways, but the completion rate is 69%, the statistics I've seen. There are some others reported differently. Other upper middle income country, it's 83%. So we are lagging behind other upper middle income countries. And of course, if we compare with OECD countries, 100%. And related to this, let's take a step further, like post-secondary education. Here it's 29%. In comparison to other, let's say Korea, it's 100%. OECD countries above 70%. And that comes back to the point that Jomo shared on the makeup of the labor market. So it's important for the government to intervene to make sure that we give our children the right amount of assets in terms of human capital. The other second policy instruments, first one, of course, like the government has done a lot, but the second one, it's also the government has introduced a minimum wage, which the second instrument, I can broaden it beyond the minimum wage, is to look at the relative factor prices. So like the government has a reason to alter certain relative factor prices, whether it's introducing the minimum wage, because here you favor the low-skilled labor when you alter the relationship between the income. So that's a legitimate also policy instrument, and lots of evidence to support this, that the minimum wage has been successful. The third instrument that I always like to look at from other OECD countries is decommodification of many goods and make them publicly provided. And if we look at reflecting on in Malaysia, the success story of Malaysia in many aspects, if we look at healthcare, healthcare historically has been decommodified, taken away from the private sector, provided by the public institutions. And if we look at the indicators, the outcome indicators for the healthcare, it's actually already OECD level. If we look at under 5 mortality, we started in time of independence at 1957. We started with under 5 mortality, 111 per 1,000 lives. Now we are about 8. So it's already the level of OECD countries. We look at other outcome, it gives us the same impression. And the reason, because the government intervened to decommodify the public health service and provide it equitably for those they need it. The same thing with education, with variety of also like the way we can look at it. Specifically, I think I would recommend to look at also preschool in Malaysia. We know that it's very important. It's critical investment, the preschool, let's say 5 to 6 years old. And whatever arrangements we have now, it's fragmented, the private sector, we cannot control the quality. I would strongly recommend that, to decommodify it, and especially now our number of children decreasing. So we'll have our schools to be vacant slowly. Just on number of children decreasing, today we have around 8.3 million children less than the age of 18. By 2050, we'll lose 1 million children. Today it's 9.3, we'll go down to 8.4. So about 1 million children we will lose. So I would rather say, since we have the schools, reduce the age of entry to school by 1 year. Decommodify it, let it be publicly provided. And the last point, last policy instruments I would strongly recommend, which your question, I'm sorry I built up the tax to come to this point, is to look at the redistributive measures or physical response. And physical response is, of course, as we know, revenue and as well as cash transfer or other instruments. Just to look at this also critically. Today we discussed the labor market inequality without the government intervention. If you look at the most inequitable labor market in the world, it's in Ireland. In 2012, relative poverty in Thailand before the government intervention, it was 42%. 42% the relative poverty without the intervention. Malaysia, without the government intervention for the same year, is 21.3%. So it's already Malaysia, the labor market's more equitable than Ireland. But after the fiscal instruments that use in Ireland, it goes down in Ireland to 9%. In Malaysia, it goes down only to 16%. So they were double us, and now it's reversed. So it tells us like this is an area where we need to look at. If we can look another example, like for instance, Iceland, they have the same labor market, the same 21% before government intervention. Iceland, because of the government intervention, it goes down to 6%, the relative poverty. Something we really need to look at. So I can, like, to be specific, because it's important to give really specific proposals. The proposal I would share right away, following on Joma's point about the obesity here, is to have tax on sweetened beverages, which I know the government is looking at. And I don't want to stop there, not only tax on the sweetened beverages, but to make sure that this revenue is earmarked for re-injecting it into cash transfer for every child, from actually every pregnant mother and children less than 2 years old. Why is that period? What we call it the 1,000, golden 1,000 day. Investment in that age group has important impact for the well-being of Malaysia in the future. Just to tell you on this one, like an investment in that age, it gives you the highest return on investment, because you know, if I go hungry 1 day or 2 days or a week, it does not affect likely my mental ability or cognitive capital. Even if it affects, who cares? But for a child, it does affect. It does affect, and it has. So the child will go to school, but will not be attentive, and he or she will participate in the labor market, will not be as productive as other well-nutrition child. The other specific intervention in fiscal response, social protection floor. We looked at today, also Jomo, you highlighted, and Noor Hisham from EPF, highlighted that coverage in EPF 50% in the labor market. And we need to be also be specific. EPF is contributory scheme. So you save, you get your return investment. What is missing is the first floor that is universally available to every category. Like, for instance, our senior citizens, to respect their contribution to the economy, that there should be a social pension that covers this group. And this, like I did some costing, it's not going to be expensive, about 6 billion ringgit for social pension. Or in total, we can have like a few investments within 2 to 3% of GDP. Thank you.
Thank you. I think you, just so that everybody got what you were trying to say, the last point about to introduce taxation to, what was the last point again? The second last point, to introduce taxation to
taxation and on sweetened beverages, not sugar, but sweetened beverages like soda,
okay.
You know.
So okay, all right.
And
so Ahmad is being true to his institution by really advocating children's welfare and early intervention and trying to reap the rewards at the back end. Maybe, Prof, you can go on the extreme end, on the other end.
Yeah, I'll talk on aging and population aging issues, and I think this is an emerging issues in Malaysia, and we have really not tackled it well yet. But if you look at the data the demographics data that we're showing, that we are aging very, very fast, and our social institutions are really not ready. But we have in place policies that has been amended in 2011, but the issue is, as Tan Sri said this morning, the issue of implementation. So I think, in order for that to happen, we need to really rethink of how we deliver services, because we know that for aging issue, it's not just the government, it is all of us has an important role to play in looking at how we can tackle aging issues. Because when you talk about aging, it is a lifelong perspective. It is, we were young once, and those social policies that were implemented will affect us and how we are in age. And also because of the situation where just this morning Hisham mentioned about, and also Jomo mentioned about not having enough money for retirement and things like that. But the issue is, as also you mentioned about the social protection floors and things like that. Yes, we need to look at the overall issues of social protection, and because we all know that our social protection is very fragmented, and we all know that we need to move together to develop a holistic social protection, but we need to move. We have been thinking about it, we have been deliberating about it, and I think this is the year for us to move, because RMK 11 is a critical year for us in the transition. So we need to act really fast, because if we are in the position right now with all the data that we have, we know about the demographics and things like that, but if we don't take action, then we'll be sorry later on, because it will be a crisis, because the new emerging inequality will be poverty in old age, and we have not handled that issue yet. But it is an emerging issue, and it's an issue of concern, because if you look at the sources of income for older person, more than 60% of the older person depends on children for support. So, and we know that in our current economic situation, children is not there, or they may not have enough money to support the older person. And in fact, the current older person are supporting their children. For example, paying 10% deposit for cars, houses, and things like that. But what happened with the money that they part to their children? Will they have enough return for their own saving, for investment for old age? And then when we talk about saving behavior, when we did a survey on asking them, well, why don't you save for old age? And many of them, adults 18 years and over in Malaysia, says it is too far away. We never think of aging, and things like that. So we need to really change our mindset for us to think for the future. Because, and if we don't have that kind long-standing, long-term thinking, then we'll be in trouble in the end. Because if you look at the present older person, 70% of them has household asset. But the future children, for example, my own children, they can't afford to own a house. So what asset or what capital or what saving can they have in terms of preparing for themselves in old age? So I think when you talk about the aging issues, we have to really talk in terms of transformative thinking of one aspect will affect all the others, and it's a repercussion of that. So I think I stop here because.
Thank you. So there you go, Johan. But before you answer, I'm going to make the question a bit more harder. So Amjad has just advocated on the early side, and then Prof has gone on the other end. So it seems that the need for government intervention to respond to inequality needs to be more specific and more targeted. And yet, I think, I may be wrong, you have to defend that, government and fiscal policy has been rather, I don't know, I as an economist, I think it's too much driven by wanting to get some growth target numbers rather than trying to solve a specific problem. So I'm just throwing it at you and see how you respond to this.
Ampun Tuanku, Your Highness, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamualaikum, and a very good afternoon. Thanks, Nung. I think it's always the after lunch session. It's always quite tough. It's always bad enough being government. I'm duty bound to also respond to some of the things that Jomo said, obviously. And as a friend, always happy to agree to disagree. But I think let me just make. I want to just really make 3 main points. I think on this context of policies to address inequality, I think first is the point that we certainly have been very successful in the past due to the policies that we've implemented. I think second, the government continues to be very committed to the issue of addressing inequality. But third, certainly many of the issues raised by the presenters this morning and also Jomo certainly do warrant major challenges that we do need to look at, and certainly warrants a change in approach and policy going forward. But I thought it's very nice, if I can borrow from Tan Sri Andrew Sheng's comment, I think it's quite a nice phrase to say that, by and large, we have certainly succeeded, but we can do better. But I think to start off on the point of, the first point about, in terms of success, I think much of what's discussed this morning clearly highlights, some various successes. In terms of addressing inequality, we have certainly addressed poverty, reducing it from then 97.9% down to 0.4%. Gini coefficient is also improved down to 0.399. I think as part of the KRI work as well, the work on how we certainly have shown this upward mobility in terms of class. And I think that certainly is testimony to what we see today. So this is all really, I guess, part of the spirit of, I think, growth with equity. I think Tan Sri Sulaiman was there in EPU when that whole spirit of growth with equity. And I think that's, and hinting towards what you're mentioning, and it was also mentioned by Alan, we want equity, but we also need growth to afford the better equity. And moving on to my second point, the government continues to be committed. I think under the current administration, under Prime Minister Najib, we do see, for example, under the new economic model, very clear articulation that yes, we want to proceed with high income, but that objective does not stand alone. It is to be done in the context of inclusiveness and sustainability. And I think that some credit needs to be given. Obviously, I can't necessarily agree with Jomo's characterization of the development phases, especially the last one. But certainly, we do see the commitment in terms of fiscal consolidation and certainly expending a significant amount of political capital in really ensuring the strengthening and sustainability of government finances, whether in terms of the subsidy rationalization, reduction of GST, have certainly been key policies which I think have been very important in sustaining the fundamentals of our fiscal position to enable us to continue the good work that we're doing in supporting the sort of public services, very extensive public services that we're doing, whether in terms of healthcare, education, rural development, that is part and parcel of addressing not just driving growth, but also a more inclusive growth going forward. But having said all of that, I think we do recognize that there are new challenges. Certainly some of the things that we hope to achieve has not been fully been achieved, and certainly that warrants us to then look at what are areas that we can need to change. Whatever that we need to do obviously needs to be based on facts and statistics, but at the same time, as the phrase goes, there's always lies, damn lies, and statistics. In that respect, maybe I'll look at it in terms of three areas. I think first, there was the statistics. Again, I thought it's a very good point that was made by Professor Ravi Kambo, this idea about looking beneath the statistics, because sometimes much can be hidden by looking at headline statistics or averages. And in looking at our, for example, poverty, we've obviously successfully reduced our national poverty rate down to 0.4%. But when you then look at a state level, states like Sabah have it at 2.9%, and certain districts have even double-digit poverty rates. So that certainly requires us to now look more on a more localized level, a more spatial approach, perhaps more what perhaps in the past when we've done a very much national breadth of policies, may perhaps be less relevant to the nature of poverty that we face today, and therefore that requires us, particularly at my colleagues and I at EPU, as we look at the midterm review for 11 Malaysia plan, and even going forward as we think about TN50, how can we make national economic planning and addressing economy a bit more spatial and a bit more localized to where there are concentrations, particularly in terms of poverty. I think we see similar issues when we look at even issues of salaries. We see salaries by and large going up in average, but as Hisham mentioned, the experience varies by depending on demographics. At the same time, I think Jomo raised a good point about what really at the net effect is the experience of our households. On one hand, we're very happy that we see the bottom 40 showing good income growth. We see about 6% income growth last couple of years. But we know that their monthly expenditure has grown by double that. So again, what's the net? Are they better off? And certainly that also requires us to, and I think that's why in the 11 Malaysia plan, we've then shifted that focus towards more interventions towards the bottom 40 and how we can then support their continued income growth going forward. And this is the first part about looking beneath, I guess, the broad averages and headline statistics. I think the second one is, I think as policymakers, we then perhaps need to start looking at what we call the right statistics, because sometimes we tend to look at the statistics that are easier to measure and then focus on that. Whereas I think in some of the discussions, we pride ourselves in the reduction in our improvement in our income Gini coefficient, but certainly I think some of the discussions this morning is the importance to increasingly look at wealth. I think wealth inequality certainly is something to be concerned about. I recall the Prof that mentioned, a Gini coefficient of 0.69 or 0.65 was considered very high. And we know from, I think, the KRI State of Households 2 report that that's exactly the Gini coefficient of our EPF holders, where we have a situation where our top 0.2% of 20,000 EPF holders have more in their accounts than the bottom 47% or 3 million account holders. So that certainly shows a very big inequality at a wealth level. And even more so, the same report refers to a Gini coefficient of ASB of 0.85, which then suggests this thing as we were still perhaps early on in a mindset of NEP looking at intra-ethnic inequality. Now it's within ethnicity inequality that perhaps we need to be giving further attention and more close attention as we move forward. I think linked to that also is how do we then generate higher income towards ensuring the catch-up, particularly in SMEs. I was very attracted to what Trustee Andrew was saying in terms of the spirit of Islamic finance. The government does a lot to help SMEs through funds and soft loans and all that, but perhaps the essence of it is there needs to be more risk capital. I think we've started dabbling in it. For example, when we introduce even interventions on inequality like Equinas, it was intended also to be part of that risk capital to help support the growth of up-and-coming SMEs and beyond. But certainly that is something we need to look going forward. How do we then supplement the banking system? And we started again, Bank Negara and SC started looking at things like equity crowdfinancing and the like. But certainly that's one area where to catch up, as what Trustee Andrew said, we need to then embrace more risk, but risk requires risk capital. You cannot rely on the banking system to do so. I mean, the last bit is that, I spoke about perhaps looking beneath the statistics. What are other statistics we need to look in terms of policies? I mean, the last bit is the interplay with other statistics. And I think I was actually quite, not say disturbed, but I think it was very troubling. I think the last slide that came from Alan, and I think it was also touched on by Jerome. We like it, obviously, when inequality improves. We would ideally want a situation where we can have both our cake and eat it, i.e. having high growth and better equality as what you suggested happened in the 70s. But it's a bit of a concern on Alan's slide where we actually see that part of the improved share of labor of income, I mean, we have improved. When PM first came in 2009, our compensation of employees as a percentage of GDP was about 28%. It's now at least improved up to 35%, but we're still below our peers, like Singapore, Korea, and Thailand are above 40%. So we need to improve that share of labor. But we don't want that improvement at the expense of future growth potential. I mean, part of the explanation was that one was in terms of improvement in self-employment. That I think is fine. I think that's supportive, in terms of greater growth of urban jobs and in terms of high labor participation of women. That's an area where we've seen it improve from, pre-2008, it was hovering at about 46%. Now it's at least increased up to 54%, and we hope to continue to rise it towards our target of 59% by end of 2020. But the other two reasons why our share of labor have increased, we're not so happy. One was in terms of a shift to sectors which have a higher labor income, and the other one which is where it's more labor intensive. I think we also see some of these concerns coming up, or these concerns of deindustrialization appearing in our trade figures. Our exports, our share of electronics has reduced and more compensated by resource-based manufacturing exports. So certainly as we look ahead to TN50 and ahead post-2020, I think industrial policy is certainly something that at least we at EPU and certainly our colleagues at MITI and MIDA are looking at as we looked at how can Malaysia embrace Industry 4.0, recognizing these various challenges, because certainly I think we recognize that for us to achieve developed nation status or high income and beyond, I think there's a general sense that we need to improve what we call the complexity of the economy. I guess that's referring to some of the work done by Houseman. I think we certainly want to see our economy moving up the value chain, and that's certainly something we've not been as successful before. I think previously the growth model was once very much led on a low-cost model. It was FDI-driven. we have perhaps, unlike, say, our counterparts in Taiwan and Korea who started electronics at the same time, they have been able to migrate to something where there's a lot more homegrown IP and giants, whereas we remain to be in one of the works which EPU did, commissioned by Monash University, found that even our pace setters in our different sectors are still what we call imitators as opposed to innovators. And certainly that is one of the key shifts that we need to do. And that is a sort of growth that I do believe will also contribute to better inclusiveness. And I'll just stop there.
So thank you, Johan. I think one of the things that have been underappreciated, at least for the Najib administration, was actually the necessity to do trade-offs. If government were to remain the same size without growing, and there are fiscal constraints, the additional demand for government intervention at new areas would require government to exit or do things differently. And I think that was something on both the revenue side and the expenditure side. I think under this Prime Minister, things were done, but the communication on that is perhaps bad. But since nobody has addressed the issue about, and you've touched on it, the issue of the share of labor and capital in the whole. If you look at the social accounting metrics, if you slice household income into that which is contributed by labor and that which is contributed by capital, you could see that the share of capital is quite sizable. And then if you looked at, say, the level of indebtedness, a household is something like, 80% or something like that. But then you look at total household financial assets by household, is 2.5 times that debt. So at the aggregate level, it looks like it's okay. But what that suggests, those two statistics suggest, is actually there's a whole bunch of very high income fellas at the high end who owns all these assets, right? And maybe the level of debt is perhaps accrued at the lower end. So this disparity between the disparity in asset ownership that results in inequality needs to be looked at. I'm going to ask Jomo before I open to the floor, from a corrective taxation policy, right? Because if you and I were to go out and work, our income gets taxed. If we accumulate enough money and we trade in the stock market and we make money, it's not taxed. So that's a source of, and it can possibly be corrected by some taxation policy. I was trying to get that out from two of you, didn't get out. Maybe briefly before I open to the floor. You raised the same issue just now about the imbalance between the share of labor income and capital. I mean, we don't want to get into this 1960s and 70s social capitalist kind of thing, but it's kind of relevant right now, I think. Very quickly, Domo.
Yeah, I think you raise a very, very important dilemma, and that is how we look at these numbers. In a very open economy, very globalized economy, I'm not sure it's very easy to track these numbers anymore. Simply looking at the capital and the labor share of income, when the share accrues abroad, for example, it disappears from our national income, our usual national income accounting, right? So if, for example, a company is owned from abroad and it makes money here, what do we say about it? And this is going to be facilitated if you have an investment agreement which actually enables companies to own from abroad. But I think you raise a very important issue that we really desperately need two things. One, we need we need cross-border taxation and investment agreements, and I think there has to be. We have to look at these things very, very seriously because that's the only way. I mean, we can deal with this. But the other thing which you also raised and hint at is the importance of wealth. If you look at the recent surveys on billionaires, okay, in the world, more than a third of their wealth is not made by themselves, it's actually inherited. Okay? If you look, for example, at the list of the richest women in Malaysia, according to what's Focus magazine, you know, the top 3 are all widows. Okay? Just in case you're running out soon, they're all in their 90s. Yeah? But I think the point is, you know, the point is that a lot, you know, so this myth that, you know, that people are rich because of their hard work and so on and so forth, I think we have to get away from that. But I think you raise very, very important questions about the nature of taxation, and we need to think not only about income taxation, we need to think about wealth taxation, but this will not work if it is not, if there are no international agreements to ensure that this is not shared. And this is why I think some of that it's very unfortunate that in the year 2015, there was no agreement made on ensuring multilateral progress towards an international tax agreement. Thank you.
Johan wanted to say something quickly.
If I can just respond, and I think I know where you're going at, because I think even when Jomo mentioned that Malaysia is a regressive tax system, some of us probably just taken aback, because obviously our income taxes, you know, we don't tax people, you know, people, you know, well below, in more than half, you know, who earn below 3,000. I know Datuk Siti Zawiyah is there who oversees the tax at MOF. You know, a good portion of the workforce doesn't even pay any income taxes. Then after that, above 3,000, obviously, then it's actually a very progressive income tax. But where it becomes quite regressive, obviously, is that our wealthiest individuals in Malaysia, when they make a capital gain, that obviously is not taxed in Malaysia. And that certainly contributes to the regressiveness of an overall tax system. But, you know, these conversations, and I know we often have it in budget dialogues, I think this comes back to what Tan Sri Andrew said. There needs to be a new social compact. Hisham alluded to there needs to be more taxation to afford the sort of things that we want for society. And capital gains is something that we need to, I think, have a long dialogue. Because obviously, on one hand, we've had, I would call a mercantile history where, you know, we developed because of entrepreneurs taking the risk, creating jobs, creating investments. But that was reliant on very much a model where you had cheap, unskilled labor, so never mind, you know, let the rewards go to the owners of risk capital. But certainly as we now move forward, where we want to go forward to a knowledge-intensive, innovation-led economy, where we want highly skilled professionals and rewarding that accordingly, we now perhaps need to be a bit more, shall we say, equitable in terms of the sharing of the tax burden between those skilled professionals and the owners of risk capital. And that's one rebalancing. You know, in theory, yes, I think it makes sense, but I think this is a conversation or social compact that needs to be had with our industrial classes.
Datuk Siti probably propose a tax on inheritance or estate tax for the 3 widows that inherited billions. Let's look at some of the questions that have been put up, and maybe we answer some of those. Am I to understand that there's no question from the floor, just looking at this? Just looking at, I mean, just looking at the question. So maybe we can take one of those. Okay, there you go, the inheritance tax, cross-border taxation, GST. Okay, we address some of those things. Maybe, Prof, anything? Just to be, maybe I have to be equitable, Johan.
Yeah. Although, maybe what I would like to add is about the tax, because the inheritance tax, because last time we had that, and then after that we abolished. And then I think we need to relook at these things, because I think what we need to do is we really need to look at the funding issues of how we want to support social services. Because I think somehow, because of the socio-economic changes that are experienced by the families, we somehow need to look at the formal transfers. Because the informal transfers may no longer be available or may be dependable for the older person. So maybe we need to look at how we can fund these new initiatives that we have to think about. Because before we never think about having a formal transfer for looking at old age, because our main value is the family is taking care of the older person. But in times are changing, and many of us has internationalization of our families, because they work overseas and they come back and things like that. So we have a lot of co-modification of institution now, and the children just transfer money into the system, and that's it. So I think we really need to look at how can we fund this kind of new situations where there is a need for this. It's not because that our value is changing, but it's also because of the situation that we are facing, because we know our fertility level is very low, and there's no available, quote-unquote, children to take care of you, things like that, because we have 1 or 2 children at most now, and some of us choose not to have children. So what do we do in terms of care for the aged in the future? So we need to buy service.
So the nature and scope of what government does
has
to change.
Yeah.
But the problem, if you ask people from Treasury during budget periods, the existing ones are taking up so much. So to do new things or
right.
new...
but
the former budget director is
right.
in front of me.
Yeah, but the existing one, I think, it has to be from the perspective of productive welfare. It's not a doling kind of concept. So it has to be from productive welfare perspective, where by giving that, we are assisting the people in the social transfers to get more skills, to develop capital, and to create wealth. So the perspective of doling shouldn't be there, but only for certain marginalized people that needs that, then go ahead. But the other perspective, they are able and things like that, and a lot of countries are looking at productive welfare as an element for social protection. So we really need to think out of the box for us to do that. Because if we don't do that now, starting now, it is quite tough. And also another issue that we need to think about is decentralization. Because Thailand experimented that, and also Indonesia experimented that in 2005. And because the issue of population is the issue at the ground level, at the district level and things like that. So, and the people at the district level knows best, not the federal level in terms of policy making and things like that. So we need to really look through of how we can look at decentralization. And I know in NAP and also in NAM, there were paragraphs about talking about decentralization, but it has not happened. So maybe we need to relook at this again and see how we can sort of slowly decentralize some facilities and things like that. And in fact, in RMK 11 also, we're talking about inclusiveness and also decentralization. But the real detail of decentralization is not in that document.
Yeah, because the federal, I'm trying to defend the government here, because the federal structure in Malaysia, I mean, the point made by Ellen in one of the slides that showed that the first-tier states compared to the second-tier states and the third-tier states, actually, in terms of the relative distance between the third-tier states, second-tier states to the first-tier states, it hasn't changed. And the issue about decentralization and customization of fiscal intervention where need is needed, I should say that depends on the kind of stuff that happens in April or March this year. It's one that is determined in the political market, because we have for so long, we always have a rich uncle in the form of the federal government. And the state government, basically most of them, are not financially, what shall we say, able, and they can't do much. And everything depends on the federal government. And then there is the issue of implementation mechanism, where the instruments of implementation are federalized. And it's very difficult to design from Putrajaya interventions that are specific to localities, unless the financial responsibility goes with it. But the intergovernmental financial responsibility is not really quite there yet. But point taken on that. We have about less than 10 minutes. I'll take one of those questions. Things about, we spoke about minimum wage, we spoke about BRIM earlier. Last question on the board. Is that true? 1970s poverty level, I think still relevant. Was it 1970? Johan.
It's updated. But can I just respond a little bit? Because I think...
Okay, this is better.
No, I think it's because you're talking about issue of federal, state, and I don't really want to go into that because obviously they're constitutional matters. But as a principle, I think what we want to aspire more is more what we call participative or democratization of governance. And I think you've already seen that. I think PM has spoke about, the era of government knowing best is over. And I think that's well demonstrated. If you look at the budget speech, not to bodek Datuk Siti Zawiyah, but every year, Ministry of Finance does their crowdsourcing of ideas. So even like, for example, measures like My Brain 15 was something that was sourced from the public, and significant public expenditure was used there because that is what was required. Even in the most recent Budget 2018 speech, some measures, for example, like the extension of the maternity leave from 60 to 90 days was sourced from public contribution. And perhaps a bit closer in terms of this concept of participative governance. I think that's why the PM also even announced the extension of a regulatory sandbox approach. If we don't know best, let's work with the industry in terms of identifying what are new innovations which we should then explore. And even there was a specific measure on a 50 million fund for a matching grant for social enterprise. So this idea of, government may not necessarily always be the best party to solve social problems. So it signals an indication of wanting to work with civil society, NGOs, or social enterprise. And another twist to it is that in terms of how this matching grant was going to be allocated, it's going to be done through a sort of like a Kickstarter type approach. Magic is establishing a website, a platform called Activate, where the public actually then votes and also puts matching funds to then help guide, because perhaps they know best in terms of how to address that. I think this is sort of direction, I think, that we see the government is trying to go to going forward.
Thank you. I'm trying to get Amjad in the conversation. As somebody who's looking at things from outside.
I would like to echo what Johan said about like contributory decision making. It's also like to include the young people in and which is like the Vision 40 and 50. I just like to throw a couple of examples just like for us to reflect. If you would think about like how young people voted globally, we think about, for instance, the US election. They voted for not the current president. For the Brexit, they also voted to stay with the EU. And the older generation, our generation, who did the wrong decision, who in many aspects, they decided to go a different way. So what I'm saying, like young people involvement in the decision making, it actually adds the new dimension. They technologically savvy, they see things differently. It's just also like, I know, like I'm a foreigner, I can be naive and say certain things. Related to this, it's also like it struck me to end it with a little joke that the age of voting here is 21 years old. Not to make too many things, but a person less than 21 years old can make a decision to get married to her MP, to get that big decision, like 20 years old, she can or he can get married to the MP in the same community, and she or he cannot vote for her. If you see the logic here, you can make a serious decision to vote. You're not allowed to vote, but you can get married to her, which is more serious decision, I would say. So I would like just to not to get too much in there. I know I'm a foreigner, I'm naive, I can't say this, but I took it as like a way where we can encourage young people to participate.
It's an interesting question that just came up at the last one. It says, since we have 5 more minutes, why punish the productive, the ones by taxing wealth and capital? We should automate government or make it smaller and close the likes of Khazanah, Equinas, and pay off government debt and pay for the services. You see, this is actually, it's a good, fair question actually, but that comes back to the whole issue of what is the nature of the so-called compact, or what do we want to do. Unfortunately, matters of that sort will have, like that question, will have to be resolved in the political market, as opposed to in this sort of market. It's not economics, it's actually politics that decides on those sort of issues. And politics responds to its own set of imperatives, which may lead to policy responses that may not address some of the more fundamental stuff, not all of it, because the horizon of political market is actually 5 years, and some of the more structural issues that you've been mentioning are of longer horizon than 5 years. I was a member of parliament once, so I sort of know these things. So but I turned out to be very bad at it, so that's why I'm doing this now. Why don't you do that, Jomo? The last question.
Your last question.
Yeah, no,
if I understand your last question correctly, it's about the interface between politics and economics. Yeah. And I think it's important, if I may, to correct the impression that I was making a pejorative statement about rentiers. I think it's very important for us to understand that the contemporary nature of capitalism is hardly competitive. And people like Professor Kanbur has spent a lot of time together with Joseph Stiglitz and others looking at imperfect competition, the existence of rents, and the consequences of the existence of rents. I think when we call something an incentive is essentially a rent which is allocated to induce you to do something. There's nothing terribly pejorative about that. Now, what has happened over time, over the last half century, if I can put it that way, is that we have a situation where the richest people in the country are people who are sitting on monopolies or duopolies. Okay, I mean, you think about the gambling rents, for example, the gambling monopolies, or think about the food import, APs and so on and so forth, and a variety of other monopolies. So if you now say, oh, Malaysians are now mature, we can invest all over the world, go and invest wherever you like, then there is very little incentive for them to reinvest within the economy. So I think it is a mistake from a policy point of view to equate the rich with captains of industry. We do not have any serious captains of industry in the country. And this is our problem. I think this is the big difference between Southeast Asian capitalism and Northeast Asian capitalism. If we look at Northeast Asia, you have, the Japanese companies, LGs, and all the rest of it. And they are internationally competitive. They are at the cutting edge. Now, we have some Malaysians who do produce things which are at the cutting edge. But if we look, for example, at our figures on R&D, on serious R&D and inducing those kinds of that kind of effort, which is badly needed in order to be a serious capitalist. I mean, you think, for example, about what induced Chinese businessmen to put their money into renewable energy. For a couple of years, the Chinese government gave a lot of incentives, and people took up the incentives, and within 3 years, Chinese producers became the most competitive in terms of producing photovoltaic solar panels, as well as wind turbines. Now, they would not have done it if you just simply left it to the market. So you get a desirable policy outcome in those circumstances. In Northeast Asia, you had effective protection conditional on export promotion. You had to promote, you had to export in order to qualify for some temporary protection. So I think it is this kind of creative use of the reality that we live in a world of imperfect competition where we are going to make some progress. I think the other thing which which I should mention is that I think we have to learn, there is a great deal we can learn from economic history. And we may well be in a situation not unlike the final years of colonialism, where you basically have strong foreign ownership of the Malaysian economy and a significant, with profits or rents being extracted. And I say that very deliberately because what does it mean for the colonial state to give land to a foreign company? What is that? If that is not a rent? So I think we need to begin to understand these realities. You know, I'm saying this with a great deal of humility because Tuanku's recent book basically forces us to begin to think about the contemporary parallels with the colonial past. And we don't want to get back into that situation. There's a great deal, I mean, when we think about Professor Jayadev's discussion about international income distribution, which is what Branko Milanovic is talking about, we need to begin to understand the role of trade. We need to begin to understand financial investments. We need to begin to understand financial globalization, what Tan Sri Andrew was referring to. And if we fail to do so, I think it is only at our own peril. And this is, I think, is why I think this kind of session, the kind of discussion, I think you've provoked, Johan. I think it's very important for us to learn in order to go forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jomo. I'm glad we ended on that one. Can I invite the floor to show appreciation to the panelists? And,
thank you.
I thank all of them. I apologize to the organizers. I'm 2 minutes and 11 seconds over time.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nungsari.